Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns.
Hey, this is Kim Howerton, and this is Keto Life Support, episode number 109. And today, I am coming to you from Metabolic Health Summit, where I just had an amazing time over the past few days. We wound up today. Today was the end, and I'm just going to record a little recap while my memory is still fresh to give you some great details, some takeaways, a little bit of an overview. I think this is going to be fun, so let's talk about it. First of all, I want to say that Metabolic Health Summit is put on by Angela Poff, Victoria Fields, and Dominic D'Agostino, also known as Dom. And it's a wonderful event. They have had it annually. There's obviously a break during the pandemic height, but we came back together. This year it was in Santa Barbara. It's been in Florida and Long Beach, and now this time in Santa Barbara. And it was at a beautiful, lovely hotel, fabulous rooms right on the beach, super good location. I loved the location myself. It could have been a little less windy, but they had no control over that this weekend. And it started on Thursday night. Thursday night, we had a nice welcome. And hold on, I got notes. And then Jong Ro, who is this awesome man. He is a doctor. Pretty much everyone was an MD, a PhD, or an MD PhD that spoke, with a few minor exceptions. And he is, I believe, out of San Diego, a professor and a doctor, talked about some of the history around the ketogenic diet. We had Rhonda Patrick, who you might know from her podcast, Found My Fitness, talking about intestinal permeability. Audra Di Padova talked about the Max Love Project, which is childhood cancer charity. And Beth Zupacania talked about the Charlie Foundation, which you may or may not know is an epilepsy foundation around childhood epilepsy. And so Max Love and Charlie Foundation were the two charities that were supported during this weekend. And so they were a big part of the event. So that was just the starting on Thursday evening. And then we jumped in on Friday with neurological disorders. So the conference is generally organized into topics. Sometimes they're wider or more tight topics, but topics by session. And so there's like a Friday morning session, Friday evening session, or rather Friday afternoon session, doesn't go into the evening. So it's set up like that. So you can kind of have a different section. So Friday AM sessions were around neurological disorders, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, and mental illness were all included in that. So we started off with Eric Kossoff, who is at Johns Hopkins, sort of the premier institute for childhood epilepsy, and I guess also adult epilepsy they do as well. But Eric focuses on children and talking about the ketogenic diet therapy for epilepsy. He talked about kind of the history of it, where the field is at now. Susan Massino, I'm not going to hit everybody's names, but I'm going to name some. Metabolism and brain health. Dale Bredesen, who you may know, talks about Alzheimer's. He talked about metabolic health with Alzheimer's. Shabani Sethi, who is a doctor at Stanford, talked about metabolic psychiatry, which is a new field, very interesting. And Chris Palmer, who is also a psychiatrist, brought a patient actually to have a patient-provider discussion. In the afternoon on Friday, we went into cancer. Barbara Gower talked about dietary approaches to cancer prevention. Jethro, who talked about brain tumors, specifically glioblastomas, which is, I believe, the most common type of brain cancer. Nell Sayed talked specifically less about lifestyle, but an intervention on arginine depletion with glioblastoma. We had Colin Champ, who was talking about metabolism and using weightlifting, to combat or help cancer outcomes. And we had Miles Sullivan, who's an amazing guy, young guy, who had very serious drug-resistant epilepsy issues and used a ketogenic diet to treat that. And so, some highlights about the neurological disorders discussion. I'm just gonna state a few of the things that came up. Like I said, Eric Kossoff did the history of ketosis with epilepsy. And one of the things that I pulled out of that discussion was that there's now a lot more flexibility that the doctors will use when treating epilepsy with a ketogenic diet. Specifically, they used to always start with like a several-day fast to get them into ketosis faster and go into a very extreme version of therapeutic ketogenic diet, which was sort of very low protein, very, very low carbohydrate, very, very high fat. Now they're finding that maybe something like a modified Atkins or a slightly higher protein, not a high protein diet, but slightly higher than they've done before, and that the fast isn't necessarily necessary. So there's a little more flexibility in doctors being able to implement a ketogenic diet as they see appropriate for the patient. So they've found that it can be equally effective in slightly different detail. We talked about metabolic syndrome being actually tightly correlated with mental illness. So you may not know this new field of metabolic psychiatry coming up. By the way, then on Saturday, there was a special forum about it. So there's even more going on about it. It's a very interesting field, specifically looking at sort of this disorder range that's from depression to bipolar to schizophrenia, and also seeing some efficacy around binge eating disorder. These doctors, these psychiatrists, specifically Drs. Teti and Dr. Palmer, not at the same institution, but being very interested in and using the ketogenic diet as an intervention. So it's kind of two things here. They find that reversing of the metabolic syndrome can be very helpful. Essentially, there's a correlation between people having metabolic syndrome and having these illnesses. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, is a question, but there seems to be a synergistic relationship. One might lead to the other, which worsens the other, which leads to one, right? It's not just one directional. And then also just that not just resolving the metabolic issue helps these conditions, but that specifically the ketones in a ketogenic diet seem to be therapeutic to the brain in these disorders. So it makes sense in many ways because specifically, especially, bipolar disorder has a lot of parallels in treatment with epilepsy. They actually use a lot of epilepsy drugs to treat bipolar disorder. And so it might make sense then that the thing that can help reduce seizures or eliminate seizures might also be efficacious in the treatment of these mental disorders. So very interesting study going on there. And then also talking about Alzheimer's, that perhaps these metabolic alterations can bring better improvements than drug treatments, because the drug treatments for Alzheimer's, you might know, pretty crappy results. And that using this metabolic intervention in Alzheimer's, not just removal of maybe the high carb, but inclusion of higher fat for more energy for the brain. As we know, there's limited energy going to the brain in Alzheimer's, and ketones being an alternate fuel can cause more fueling in the brain and reverse some of the cognitive decline in terms of already existing decline. But then the discussion is also, can being in better metabolic health either stall or prevent the progression or the appearance of Alzheimer's? So that discussion was super interesting. As we got into the afternoon, we talked specifically about cancer, talking about obesity-related cancers, and is it the obesity or is it the insulin? Is it the insulin at the root of it? The correlation in especially breast cancer is found with, if you look on the surface level, it looks like obesity leads to breast cancer, but in fact, when you separate out high insulin or insulin resistance compared to obesity, it turns out it's actually the insulin resistance that is more tightly correlated with breast cancer, although we know that for many people that high insulin leads to obesity, that high insulin also leads to breast cancer. So it's not causal in terms of the obesity to the breast cancer, it's that insulin is at the root of both. So higher insulin definitely implicated in breast cancer. Directly in this talk was about breast cancer, and then also in other types of cancer. As we said in the earlier mention about Sorry, I might be confusing you with these different timelines. I'm just using my memory to go over some of this. But, as I said, we heard from Barbara Gower. She talked about breast cancer. Jethro Hull, he talked about the brain tumors and the glioblastomas. The thing with glioblastomas is they're a very insidious and life-destroying and very fatal cancer for most people. But he had a very heartwarming story, actually, that one of his patients was like, I heard about this ketogenic diet, I want to do it. Dr. Who, or is it Hugh? Sorry, I might be saying that wrong. His first name is Jethro. He kind of was like, sure, well, talk to the nutritionist, on staff. And he thought the nutritionist would say no, that they had a new nutritionist. And she's like, sure, I'll help you implement that. So he came back and said, we're going to do it. And this doctor, who seems like a very lovely man, was like, all right, well, I'll do it too. So he undertook the ketogenic diet as well to try it out. And several of his patients came along for the ride. So there was this whole group of them. Now, this is not the same thing as a trial, right? It was not an official trial, but they all decided to do it together. And a bunch of his patients. And what did he see was just much better outcomes, both shrinking of the tumor and also just a better quality of life, which then led him to do an actual trial where they looked at outcomes. So that was kind of a heartwarming story. And with glioblastoma, obviously the desire is as much as possible to preserve life, to reduce mortality, all that kind of stuff. But what he talked about very much was sort of these patients, even if they did end up dying eventually, which many of them do, they got much better quality of life. They felt better, they thought better, they were less exhausted. So there was a lot of benefit. Even I think we all think we have this happy ending story in mind where, and the cancer went away and everyone got better. And it's not always that, but sometimes it's really about improving quality of life along the way. And that seems like that definitely was happening. And then talking about Colin Champ, talked specifically again with breast cancer, talked about the better outcomes when people had more muscle mass, when they did weightlifting. Also, a lot of the treatments for breast cancer cause osteoporosis, and how weightlifting improved bone density. So actually countered the effect of the breast cancer treatment. By the way, I should say, in most instances when we were talking about using a ketogenic diet for cancer, that these researchers and doctors, they were not doing a ketogenic diet. Instead of, they were doing it in addition to intervention with surgery and or drugs. So just wanted to make that point clear in case it wasn't. But it seemed in Colin Champ's work, he saw with higher muscle mass, a reduced reoccurrence of breast cancer. So better survivability, better quality of life, less recurrence of the cancer from having a higher muscle mass. So he actually runs a strength training arm of his treatment. He's an MD, but he does strength training interventions with patients who are having cancer treatments. And then, as I said, Miles Sullivan, who's this awesome young man who had a brain tumor removed, which then turned into some very serious epilepsy, constant seizures, constant pain, just a level that caused such life disruption. And he was basically, didn't know what to do. It was his life, quality of life was pretty awful after that. And I believe he was maybe 19 at the time. He was very young, and he's still very young. But years later, he's now been seizure-free on a ketogenic diet, and his life has transformed. So that's super exciting. On Saturday, the focus was on just metabolic therapies in the morning, and we talked with Dr. Robert Lustig on hacking our bodies and brains, sort of how the food system has stolen some of our control there. Andreas Anfeld, who runs Diet Doctor, talked about low carb protein and satiety. Dr. Jamie Seaman discussed women's health and a ketogenic diet. Dr. Brett Shearer discussed the evolution of LDL hyperresponders, which you might have heard. So does LDL go up on a ketogenic diet? And then we heard from Dr. Glenn House about metabolic dysfunction and spinal injury. It was a super new topic to me and very interesting. The afternoon session was on metabolic health and COVID-19. They discussed sort of long COVID and some therapies around ketogenic diets and possibly the use of oxygen therapy in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to help with treatment of COVID-19. There was also a metabolic psychiatry special forum. So as I discussed the day before, we had the introduction of the idea of metabolic psychiatry, and then there was a special forum on it. Super interesting, lots of interesting people on the panel, and just a furthering of the discussion. And then there was also a discussion around using ketone esters to treat or prevent some of the cognitive decline that comes from hypoxia or high altitude issues, specifically for things like special forces, so the military. Some things that came out of those discussions were, Robert Lustig is a doctor that he's not anti-keto, but he's not pro-keto necessarily, but he very much talked about the issue with fructose being problematic in his talk. As some of you might know, Diet Doctor has kind of moved in a higher protein direction. And so Andreas talked about higher protein and increased satiety being very helpful, especially in people looking for fat loss. Jamie Seaman is a MD. She specifically is a OBGYN and talked about women's health, hormones, the cycle of hormones with a woman during different phases of her cycle, and the effects on the metabolism. Brett Shearer with the LDL, very engaging speaker. He also works for Diet Doctor, but he's also an interventional cardiologist. I mean, kind of one big takeaway from what he talked about was you can compare lipids like directly in terms of cardiovascular health, or you can run various models around putting different things into a model where it'll tell you your cardiovascular risk. And in people who go keto, even if they do have increased LDL, most of the time when you plug their numbers in, including other metabolic markers, their overall risk decreases even with that increased LDL. So looking at sort of heart disease issues as more multifactorial, and that it's not just about your LDL numbers. And then Glenn House, super interesting because I'd never thought about this. So Dr. Glenn House was someone who in college had a spinal cord injury while skiing. He's now, I imagine, in his 50s. It's been quite some time since this happened. But he is someone who, even after the spinal cord injury, went on to go to medical school, became a surgeon, and he's a very inspirational guy. But one of the things he brought up was that in people with spinal cord injuries, there is almost always then resulting metabolic syndrome issues. Well, because our muscle is our main glucose sink, if you're not using your muscles very much, right? If your leg muscles don't work, or maybe your arm muscles don't work, or many of your muscles don't work, right? You can't engage those muscles, you're not going to get the same kind of glucose sinking that you would from a person who's actually using their muscles. And so metabolic syndrome is going to occur both for the reason that their muscles aren't pulling that glucose out of circulation, but also there can just be that inflammatory cascade. So higher inflammation is one of the results of this injury for most, and you're going to have that insulin resistance being caused directly from the inflammation as well. And so he talked about some of the ways you can address these issues, and one of which that he tried was changing over to a ketogenic diet, and many of his health markers improved on a ketogenic diet. So he remains on that ketogenic diet, and it's been a huge change in his overall metabolic health. It's a very inspiring story. So on Sunday, the last day of the conference, we talked specifically about optimizing human performance. And Dr. Elaine Xiao talked about, I'm not maybe saying that right, but I apologize. She talked about epilepsy treatment, ketogenic diet being beneficial for epilepsy, but then how does a ketogenic diet shift the gut microbiome? And then what they did is they then wondered what the gut change had to do with the improvement in people with epilepsy. And they in fact found in mice models that when they changed the gut biome to match a ketogenic diet, they reduced epilepsy in the mice as well. So there was an impact of this gut biome in mice reducing epilepsy, not just the diet directly, but also the gut biome being implicated in how this process works in reducing seizures. However, within a few days of returning to their old diet, they stopped having a protective effect. But it's an interesting first step in looking at how the gut can impact other metabolic issues. Tommy Wood talked about muscle and brain, and essentially, long story short, the more muscle you have, the stronger your brain will be as you age. the better your memory will be, the better your cognitive functioning will be, and more muscle mass is a good idea. Sachin Panda spoke, who you might know in the fasting world. Lucia Aronica spoke about genetics and keto response, and then Dom D'Agostino talked about applications for a ketogenic diet. And some interesting takeaways from those was very much around being aware of your proper circadian rhythm, knowing your sleep cycle, knowing what the best time is to go to bed. Essentially, the big recommendation, I think, that I pulled away from that talk was get light. Outdoor light. Even on a cloudy day, you're getting enough. It doesn't have to be bright light outside, but go outside and get early morning light right after you wake up. Go for a short walk, get that light in your eyes for a little while. At the end of the evening, after the sun goes down, you want to transition to lower light conditions. You don't want super bright light at night. You want some time after dinner before you go to bed for better sleep. You have what do you call, like a wind down period. Be social, talk to family, start to relax before going to bed, get in better lower light evening conditions, and then go to bed at a decent hour, which sort of looked like was around 10ish, and try to avoid shift work. Those were some of the takeaways around that. And one of the things that he also saw was that late night eating was some of the most destructive form, though whether that's because it was late at night or the kinds of things people pick to eat late at night could be up for debate, but definitely it did not work out well when people went for the late night snackies. So those were pretty much most of the talks. If I missed any, I'm so sorry, but I think I covered most of it from what I recall. And my big takeaways, what am I pulling from this conference? Well, first I would like to say I feel like I'm very on brand and very on trend that this year, as I've been focused more on muscle mass and weightlifting, that seemed to be validated by several of the speakers talking about the importance of growing muscle mass, and that our lives can be advanced and improved so much by paying attention to our metabolic health. So it was an inspiring weekend. It was an invigorating weekend. The other thing I would like to say is I went to their Gala event, which is they put on this dinner, which is how they support the Max Love and the Charlie Foundation. They sell tickets to this gala dinner where we had meat from US Wellness Meats, which was lovely, and ice cream from Killer Creamery. And that was super fun. Oh, I didn't even talk about the vendors. Hold on, I'll talk about the vendors. And there was dancing. We dance our booties off. This is the best dance party. I mean, granted, it's the only dance party I go to all year, but it is something I really look forward to. Everyone is fun and welcoming and connected, and everyone is smiled at, right? Like there's no exclusion. I'm not dancing with you. It's very fun. The music was fun. There was some 80s music played, but not only 80s music played. It was very good. So we had a good time. Got nice and sweaty. My legs were tired, and it was a lovely evening. So that's my favorite party. Okay, so the sponsors. So at conferences, you haven't been to one yet, but I'll just fill you in. There are often sponsors where there are tables and booths set up where people put out samples of different things, or there are people there to talk to you about their product. I tried a lot of really great things. Salvation brownies are amazing. I tried those. There was a new candy I'd never seen called Keto Cracked, which is, I think it's spelled like KRAC''D. They had like a Butterfingers type candy and a Samoa's type candy. They were all amazing, and those people were really amazing. I keep saying amazing. Keto Chow was there, Redmond's Real Salt. I'm going to miss some because I did not prepare notes on this section, but so many good vendors. So what I'll have to do is list the vendors. So in the notes, I'll list a bunch of vendors with my notes about them so that you can know what's there, but it was super top notch. And US Wellness Meats, who provided meat for the gala, were there giving out little samples of meat all day, as was Killer Creamery with some ice cream sandwiches. Oh, Legendary Foods, who make little pastry pockets. They're like Pop-Tarts. They made like fancy Pop-Tarts. I think they're better than Pop-Tarts actually, but they're, Pop-Tart type thing. And then also Noosh Foods was there all weekend making pancakes. They have a really wonderful pancake mix. So there was pancakes galore. So that was the weekend. I had a great time. Tomorrow I'm back home and gonna enjoy a few days of rest before I'm actually heading out for the low carb cruise. And so I'm gonna call it a night right now as I'm recording and try and save my voice for the cruise, because there was a lot of, you forget how loud a dance party is, and there's a lot of yelling. So my apologies if my voice was a little hoarse this week. I appreciate you all for listening. I hope this was useful, this little recap. I'll put notes about the event in the notes section so you can get a little more detail. And if I butchered anyone's name and you can't understand what I said, you can see who I was talking about. And we will see you next week. Take care. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.